We live in a world that has grown increasingly wary of religion, particularly Christianity. From the rise of liberalism to the rise of things like feminism and the woke movement, all of a sudden everything that has to do with formal and institutional structure is frowned upon. We have seen people grow increasingly critical of Christianity's history, particularly when it comes to colonization and slavery. This is the only time you'll see African spiritualists and the woke culture hold hands. Before we get into the video, my name is Maseko and this channel is all about Jesus. If you're new here, please don't forget to like and subscribe. We are working towards reaching 50,000 subscribers and you can make that possible. Alright, let's get into it. One thing that many people tend to discount is the role that Christianity played in the abolition and fight against slavery. There are many stories that are buried beneath the rubble of accusations, stories that are yet to be unearthed. Of course, these stories don't serve as means to excuse the horrors of the past or minimize the abuse of religion in the wake of slavery. However, these stories are meant to highlight basic and simple truth about what authentic and biblical Christianity looks like. One of such stories is that of a woman known as Josephine Bakhita, who was a young girl stolen into slavery in Sudan. However, with the encounter she had from noble and authentic Christians, she found herself later being a nun and a saint in the Catholic Church. This video will help you understand that not only was her journey to freedom remarkable, but her journey was also revolutionary. Let me first start by saying this. This video is not about me vouching or endorsing the Catholic Church, but it's me vouching and endorsing true Christian values that defended the defenseless. I might not necessarily agree with many of the Catholic teachings and doctrines, but I do believe that the Catholics are brothers and sisters in the faith, since they too uphold the essentials of true Christian faith, being that they believe in the Trinity, they believe in the divinity of Christ, they believe in the virgin birth, they believe in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, in which all these things are essentials that make us part of the Christian fold. And so when it comes to the story of Josephine Bakhita, the church showed remarkable qualities of compassion and love, qualities often seen in Jesus Christ himself. Josephine's story doesn't fit the narrative pushed by many critics of Christianity today. When they speak of the church, they only tell you of the church that only oppressed, but they never tell you of a church that also liberated. They tell you of a faith that only used to enslave, but they'll never tell you of a faith that also set the captives free, both physically and spiritually. But when we look at Bakhita's life, we are confronted with a contradiction of everything the critics of Christianity ever presented to us, because her life is proof enough that even in the darkest moments of human history and religious abuse, true Christianity still shone through. That real Christianity rescued the broken and healed the wounded. And yes, even though the story of Josephine Bakhita is not a story of a perfect institution, but it reflects a story of a perfect savior, a God who worked through imperfect people to transform a slave into a saint. Josephine Bakhita was born in the Dufa region in Sudan in 1869. She wasn't born with the name Bakhita. Bakhita became actually the name that was given to her by her slave traders who stole her. Her original name was lost and was never known, as she was abducted around the age of 7 or 8 by Arab slave raiders. After her abduction, Bakhita was forced to walk barefoot for almost 1,000 kilometers. That is like me walking from Joburg, South Africa to Namibia by foot. The name Bakhita means the lucky one, which was a cruel irony for someone who would be sold and resold into slavery at least 5 times. An unfitting name for someone who was brutally beaten and scarred. In fact, one of her owners had her tattooed using a blade and sword, with over 114 deep scars across her body. From the moment she was abducted and enslaved, the world she knew had vanished, and it was now replaced by constant pain. For years, Bakhita lived under terror. Her abduction was made easy because slavery was legal in Sudan in those days, and so she was passed from one household to another, used for labor, beaten without cause, and deprived of any sense of dignity or belonging. What she went through is what we know as human depravity, a state where human beings rule another human being as though they were God themselves. Despite the terror Bakhita faced, God had not abandoned her. God was not blind to her pain. In Psalms 9 verse 9, David reminds us that the Lord is a shelter for the oppressed, a refuge in times of trouble. Eventually, Bakhita was sold to an Italian consul who decided to treat her differently. The consul did not beat her nor enslave her. When he returned to Italy, he took her with him. There, she was given to another family, the Michaelists, who placed her in the care of the Canossian Sisters, a Catholic religious institution in Venice, while they traveled. This was actually common in those times for Christians, missionaries, and even Christian institutions to purchase slaves with the intent of setting them free, rescuing them and providing protection and a new life for them. This became even more popular in the 19th century during the abolitionist movement, particularly across the US and Great Britain. I mean, you have stories like that of David Livingstone in the 1800s, who was a Protestant missionary and who was an explorer, frequently confronted slave traders in the Central and East Africa, and at times intervened to free individuals. In his letters and journals, he records buying the freedom of enslaved Africans during his expeditions. You had evangelical Christian groups in Britain, such as the Clapham sect, who worked tirelessly to end slavery. The main focus of these British abolitionist societies was to focus on legislative abolition. There are records of how some of them funded the ransoming of slaves, particularly in North Africa, through intermediaries. Before Bakhita's time in the 16th to the early 1800s, you had strong Christian collaborations between Trinitarian and Macedonian Catholics teaming up for ransoming Christian slaves captured by Muslim raiders in North Africa. You have more examples like these throughout history, and the story of Josephine Bakhita is just one of the many stories we have of such movements. Now, going back to Bakhita's story, after being bought by the Italian consul and having been given to another family and placed in the care of the Canossian Sisters, the miracle of redemption began. Not just redemption over her physical liberation, but also the awakening of her soul. The sisters treated her not as a property, not as an outsider, but as a person. Here, she learned about Jesus Christ. She encountered a God who was not cruel like her captors, but kind and loving. A God who had suffered with her and for her. A God who knew how it felt to be whipped and rejected. When speaking about this God, Isaiah 53 verse 34 tells us that he was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and he was held in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. Later, when the Michaelis family who brought her into freedom returned and demanded Bakhita be handed back to them, she refused. The case went to court, and in 1889, the Italian legal system ruled that since slavery was actually outlawed in Italy, Bakhita had been free from the first day she stepped foot into Italian soil. Despite being seen as property by her owners and those who enslaved her, it was the church that actually took her in. It was the church that defended her dignity. It was the gospel that had given her a new identity in Christ. Josephine Bakhita was baptized in 1890 and took the name Josephine Margaret Fortunata Bakhita. She later went on to join the Canossian Sisters herself. Her vocation became a symbol of contradiction. Here was a former slave who was now clothed in dignity. A servant of those who once treated her as less than human was now recognized as one made in the very same image of God. She would spend over 40 years serving the church, cooking and cleaning, welcoming guests, and teaching people about God's love. When she was asked what would she say to her captors, she responded that if I were to meet the slave traders who kidnapped me and even those who had tortured me, I would kneel and kiss their hands, because if it had not been for them, I would have not found Christ. This sounds like something Jesus himself would say. Her words reveal to me how unwilling I am to be used by Christ in the chaos of my own personal suffering. It's easy for us to place faith in a suffering Redeemer. However, it's far more difficult for us to share in his suffering. Having faced several beatings, imprisonment, stoning, shipwrecks, hunger, danger, sleepless nights, and persecution, in Philippians 3 verse 10, Paul makes us know his desires. He says, I want to know Christ and experience the mighty power that raised him from the dead. I want to suffer with him, sharing in his death. Until me and you can share in such desires, we have not fully come to the end of ourselves. Anyway, back to the life of Bakhita. After her baptism and joining the Colossian sisters as a nun, Bakhita's comments about her captors wasn't her submitting to injustice. It was her appreciating the power of the redemptive grace in the midst of injustice. Her heart was geared towards Romans 8 verse 28, which reminds us that for those who love God, for those who are called according to his purposes, all things work together for good. I see her sharing in the heart of a fellow brother in the faith, one who, like herself, was sold into slavery at a young age by his own family. When Joseph speaks to those who sold him into slavery in Genesis, he says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." In the year 2000, Pope John Paul II canonized her as Saint Josephine Bakhita. Her feast day was to be celebrated on February the 8th every year as an international day of prayer and awareness against human trafficking within the Catholic faith. When reading about her life, I was actually shocked on how outside the Catholic Church, Bakhita's name is actually unknown, particularly among our own Protestant and evangelical communities. The question I personally had was, but why? Perhaps because Protestant traditions tend to avoid recognizing saints canonized by Rome. But if we are to be honest, the story of Josephine Bakhita is not a Catholic story, it's a Christian story. And more importantly, it's a story about Jesus. Jesus who breaks chains of injustice, a Jesus who sets the captives free, a Jesus who finds a girl scarred by the world and gives her the beauty of holiness. Early church father Gregory of Nyssa once wrote in the 4th century that you condemn man to slavery, whose nature is free and independent, and you make laws contrary to God himself. This was clearly Gregory's disdain for slavery. Though the church had at times compromised or capitulated to power and politics, it had also birthed voices like Gregory's, whose theology was later lived in lives of people like Josephine Bakhita. Bakhita's life stands as a rebuke to any notion that Christianity supports oppression. Real Christianity, Christ himself, has always stood with the weak. In Luke 4 verse 18, he lets us know that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and the recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed. Now with all of this, the question you might have is, well, what can we learn from the life of Josephine Bakhita? Well, I like to present the idea that Bakhita's life teaches us that your past cannot define your future when Christ is the author behind your life story. That the wounds inflicted by people can be healed by the one who was wounded for our transgressions. That the church, when faithful to Christ, is actually a refuge for the broken and not an accomplice to the oppressor. To the world, Bakhita was property, but to God, she was precious. To her captors, she was nothing but a tool, but to the church, she became a treasure. To the system of the world, she was forgotten, but in heaven, she was known and will forever be loved. If there's anything to learn from her life, I'd like for us to learn from her faith. I'd want us to learn how to speak against injustice whenever we see it. I want us to be secure in the fact that the gospel is not the property of oppressors, but it is the hope for the oppressed. May every follower of Jesus remember that the gospel is always available amongst the poor, the enslaved, the outcasts, and the forgotten. Just like it was in Bakhita's life, let it also be in our lives. Before you choose to listen to what people will tell you about a religion that enslaves, I want you to ask them about a religion that also liberates. I want you to ask them about true, authentic Christianity. James reminds us that a religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their afflictions and to keep one's self unstained from the world. If you found value in this video, let us know in the comments. And if you want to partner with our ministry, please consider becoming a monthly member here on YouTube by hitting the join button, or consider becoming our paying member on Patreon. Links in the description. Until the next video, grace and peace.